Welcome to The Long Way, a podcast of think tank Cardus. I'm Daniel Prusilides. This is a special episode of The Long Way. Normally, we aim for a 20 to 25-minute episode focused on a feature interview. But for this episode, we'll do none of that. Instead, it'll sort of be the really, really long way. In a moment, I'm just going to step aside and let two of my colleagues do the talking, Lisa Richmond, Vice President of Research at Cardus, and Brian Dijkema, Vice President of External Affairs. If you've been following our work, you'll know that we released an open letter to the Premier of Ontario challenging him to roll back his COVID vaccine passports in the province. That led to a lot of public feedback. So now, Lisa and Brian will respond to that, and in the process, they'll lift the hood on what makes Cardus tick, what makes this think tank think the way that it does. So, here are Lisa Richmond and Brian Dijkema in conversation.
Hello, Brian.
Hi, Lisa.
How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good.
Good to be on the show with you.
Yes. So this is an experiment. So we are going to try to take listeners behind the scenes a bit at Cardus and dig into how we think through issues, how we choose issues to address. You know, they're not always issues, topics, maybe I should say. And the impetus for this, the recent one was a couple of weeks ago, we released an open letter to Doug Ford on the advisability or lack thereof of vaccine passports, the current policy in Ontario. Doug Ford's the Premier of Ontario. And we encourage people to respond to us as we always do. We welcome comments. We always read them and take them seriously. And we want to know what people think of our work. And we got a variety of responses. We got people very much in favor of the letter, the open letter. Some people very much opposed. Not a lot of people just neutral. But then as I was reflecting on that, I realized, well, those folks probably wouldn't take the time to write to us. Usually it's people who feel strongly one way or the other. So that makes sense. But we got a polarized response. And as we were thinking that over, we thought, why don't we try this podcast episode where we talk, not so much go through the arguments for and against the vaccine mandate, or vaccine passports, I should make the distinction between the two, but how is it that we came to write that letter in the first place? And what sort of considerations went through our minds as we developed our position on that? Some people who did write back to us afterwards said, why did Cardus speak into this? How does this fit into your work? So that's what we're thinking of doing for this session. Anything else you would say at the beginning here?
No, it sounds about
okay.
right. Yeah,
okay.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Sounds like a conversation we should be having more of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that we do regularly, like at lunch, we have good conversations just sitting together, us and our colleagues around the lunch table. And so we want this to be like those conversations. We want this to be as natural and real a conversation as possible. And we'll see if listeners are interested in hearing this sort of thing. And so we encourage people to send us their comments. So we did sketch out, this is going to be a natural conversation, but we did sketch out a few topics that we want to make sure we touch on. So I'm going to ask you the first one, which is, so Cardus is a Christian think tank, which is pretty unique. I don't think there's another Christian think tank in Canada. There are some in other countries and other religious think tanks that are not necessarily Christian, but of some other faith. So what does it mean for Cardus to be a Christian think tank, and how does the Christian faith inform the research and policy work that we do? So how would you answer that? And it can be longer than an elevator pitch.
Okay.
Because that's a little short.
Okay. Well, it's a great question, and that's like that's the sort of the core question. Why does Cardus even exist? So if I can't answer that well, then maybe we should just pack up our suitcases and try to get other jobs. But this is the way I like to think about it. I think a lot of times in public debate around given issues, people will make vast leaps between their when they think about it at all, they will make vast leaps between their first principles and the policy that they find. But more often than not, I actually think people don't pay attention at all to first principles when it comes to policy. They're more interested in things like, does it work or does it not? And those are important questions, and we'll get into that on the vaccine passport issue, and because we'll ask some of those as well. But you have to ask, whenever you're asking the question, does it work or does it not work, that question itself is informed by what type of society are you looking for. What view of the human person is informing your answer to does it work or does it not work? And in that circumstance, there are all kinds of different answers to those deeper questions. What kind of society should we be going after? What is the individual's place in it? What is a human being? What is their purpose? And everybody's got those first principles, whether they examine them or not. There's something deeper that's informing their approach to public policy and public life. Cardus just tries to be explicit about it. We say that our first principles are first principles that derive from the Christian social tradition, which is a very old tradition. It's a contested tradition, I would add. There's not one voice, although you can find coherence among different voices. And so we're just trying to be open and honest about that Christianity has, over the course of centuries, millennia even, informed all kinds of debates, from our use of money to questions of public health, hospitals, the preservation of life, the role of technology and science in preserving and enhancing life. And these are all questions that come up in the vaccine passport issue. And they differ with some people who are, say, utilitarians, who say we should, maximize utility for the greatest number of people and minimize harm for the greatest number of people, etc. That's a different calculus than the Christian one. And sometimes it overlaps, sometimes it doesn't. So that's why, that's not why we did particularly the vaccine passports one, but that is how Cardus's conception of a Christian think tank informs it. One further thing I would add, and I'd love to hear you, Lisa, because you actually talk about this all the time. This is one of the things when you're vice president of research, when you're doing research. One thing that I always say is, look, the tradition and the Bible on which the tradition is drawn, and the story, actually, the story of God's work in creation from beginning to the end, is not Google Maps. And a lot of times people treat it. So Google Maps, you put in your objective, I want this policy, and it'll say, turn left here, turn right here. That just doesn't work. That's not how Cardus works. There's all kinds of things that you have to think about: evidence, numbers, culture, history, all that type of stuff. So I'd love to hear you respond to that. Like, when you hear the word Christian think tank or public policy from a Christian think tank, what do you mean by that, and how do you understand it?
Yeah, so this is the one thing we talked about covering earlier. So I brought this quote. So I was recently reading a essay by C.S. Lewis, and it was about something totally unrelated to the work of think tanks. But then I came to this one paragraph, and I thought, this is a perfect statement of how I try to use the Christian faith in the development of policy options. Or in my case, I'm, like you said, responsible for research. You're the one responsible for policy, and we work together, and those things go back and forth as we develop the ultimate policy recommendations that Cardus is putting out. But let me just read this C.S. Lewis quotation, and then I'll try to unpack it, because it's a bit dense. And if anyone wants to get this again, they can feel free to email me, and I will email this to you. So he says, this being what he was talking about earlier, which is not relevant to our conversation here, but he says, this raises the question of theology and politics. And I'm going to replace the word politics with policy, which in some languages like French is the same word. We don't do politics at Cardus, we do policy. So this raises the question of theology and policy. The nearest I can get to a settlement of the frontier problem between them is this, like what belongs in each category, is that theology teaches us what ends are desirable and what means are lawful, while policy teaches what means are effective. And then he goes on to give an example. He says, thus, theology tells us that every man ought to have a decent wage. Policy tells us by what means this, the decent wage for everyone, is likely to be attained. And then thirdly, the theology tells us which of these means are consistent with justice and charity. On the policy question, guidance comes not from revelation, but from natural prudence, knowledge of complicated facts, and ripe experience. Okay, so to unpack that, I visualize a sort of circle where we have certain foundational convictions or a framework that we're starting from, where we have this vision of the good life that we think is the good life for all human beings, the way they were made to flourish. So that is the end that's desirable. But then, how do we get there? So in some particular question of the way society is structured or functions, or we need a policy, a public policy on such and such. That's where the research digs in to find out what means would be effective. But then once we've got a set of policy options on the table, we go back to our guiding framework to say which of these are consistent with justice and charity. And justice and charity comes again from those foundational, in our case, the Christian faith. So if I can give an example, we recently published a paper on marriage and on using Statistics Canada data that shows that marriage is declining, as in fewer people are getting married in Canada, and the marriage rate is declining. And so we start with saying we believe marriage is a good thing. We have a couple of reasons for this. Actually, we draw on social scientific research that shows the correlation. It's pretty well established that there's a correlation between being married and a number of other goods, both individual goods and social goods. So we have that from actually a non-theological source. But then we also have from our tradition this, guiding origin story presented in Genesis, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that says God created an first person, but that person needed a companion and a partner, and God said it's not good for this person to be alone. I'm going to make him a partner. So you don't have to believe that story literally. Some Christians do. Others view it as a beautiful narrative expressing deep truths about human beings. Either way, we draw on that tradition, and so we say, okay, marriage is a good. Then we have this question, okay, what would promote marriage? And we try to do our research in digging into what policy options might encourage Canadians to marry. Now, some, like probably the most effective way to have more Canadians married would be to force them to marry. Obviously, then our Christian faith, and you don't have to be a Christian to also have this conviction that forced marriage is not a good thing, but our Christian faith is certainly guidance for us as to why coercion is not just or charitable. So we're going to take that option off the table. It may be a highly effective means, but we're going to take it off the table. So it's this circle of motivation and impetus for our research, but then we do the research in pretty much the same way anyone would do, any think tank would do the research, but then the results, again, are guided by the results as in which policy options are we actually going to be advocating for. Those are guided again by our fundamental commitments.
Yeah.
So,
and even within, just to use your example, even within the marriage, there are things both from our tradition in terms of the motivation of what it looks like, right? The fact that man and women are made equal. They're both made in the image of God, and so they both bear that. That means that there are certain things, even within marriages, that are off the table. Sort of domineering. A domineering perspective is off the table.
What makes a good marriage?
Correct.
There's certain, our faith informs that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. So when it comes to how we do research, Lewis, going back, he says, the guidance comes not from revelations. Like I said, we're doing our research and policy development the way others would do it, regardless of their religious opinions or other way of looking at the world as to what makes a better or worse outcome for the world. They come not from that, but from natural prudence. So, just good sense of what works. A good sense of what works. Knowledge of complicated facts. That's the expertise that we're always trying to deepen in the research areas that we are involved in at Cardus. And then ripe experience. Yeah, just experience over time. It interacts with the other two, but we hope we get better. The longer we're doing something, we get better at being able to think about it, evaluate it, produce better results. So
yeah. And things like history would matter. Knowing what has happened in the past would be part of that.
Experience of others, not just our own.
Exactly.
Great point.
Exactly. Other cultures would be an important part of that, and also just paying attention to what's actually going on the ground with people. That's an important part. And one thing just to note is that that I've always say this too. All think tanks do this. A lot of think tanks say, oh, we just deal with the natural prudence and the complicated facts and experience. But that's not true. Like everybody, so CD Howe, which I think is one of the best think tanks in this country, they've done great work for many, many years. I have so much respect for them and their people. Their sort of mission is to raise the living standard of Canadians,
right,
which is a great goal. I also share that goal of raising the living standard. But when you start talking about things like standards, you're talking about better or worse. And what does it mean to have a better living standard? Is it just purely economic? Yes, obviously, we'd like more money. I would like more money. But to what end? To what end? They're agnostic on that. But there are certain things that are assumed in that notion of living standard, because you're talking about what life is and what it's for, that they assume and may not be as explicit about. All I say to people, Lisa, is that Cardus is just explicit about what everybody else already does. And I think that's healthy. I think that's healthy because even the principles that are sort of at the core for us are contestable, and we welcome people to contest it. They may say, look, this Christian view is wrong, and here's why. And we're happy to have that conversation because we think that, we do have this shared world, the complicated facts, prudence, and experience is a shared world that we can examine these things and we can test them. And so, anyways, I think that's very helpful what you just described.
Good. I think most think tanks though they are explicit about what their basic framework is that they're coming from, the assumptions that they're starting with, right? Or like what's unique about Cardus is that our first assumptions are religious in nature, but the fact that every think tank has certain assumptions it's starting with, I don't know.
For sure. I just think even beneath some of the assumptions that some are made are others that are not examined.
Right,
and so that's fine. And that's fine. Like we don't need everybody to be a religious think tank. But it's just important to say that at the very basic, as you start unpacking those things, or unpacking is not a good one, unearthing perhaps, is you get down to something that has to be taken on faith, whether you're a religious person or not. It has to be taken on something that is ultimately not falsifiable, not provable, or what have you. Something along those lines.
Right.
So, anyways.
Right. That's good. Okay, going back just though for a moment to when we talk about 2,000 years of Christian social thought, what are the sources there in particular? I mean, Christians have said all kinds of things. There's various authors or movements that we could draw on.
Yeah.
So one of the ones that we mention regularly is Catholic social teaching. So Can you just describe what are some of the themes within that? How did that tradition emerge? What are some of the more salient aspects of that?
Yeah, it's a long tradition, and as I said at the beginning, it's contested. So there are different views, different people, different parts of the Christian faith will have that.
So, sorry, do you mean when you say contested, you mean different people will lay claim to that same
Correct.
phrase and say this, what I'm presenting is Catholic social teaching.
Yeah.
Okay.
And ours I think would emerge out of a two particular, although we're open to others and there's open edges to this, so it's not, but there are two. There's I would say the sort of Roman Catholic social teaching and Reformed or Calvinist social teaching, many of which overlap. There's some differences, but they're drawing on the interaction of people who follow Jesus with public life since the book of Acts, and perhaps even beyond that. And so we're drawing on people like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and Irenaeus and Hugo Grotius and Johannes Althusius, and you could go on and on. But a lot of these scholars have talked about John Chrysostom, which is more in the Eastern tradition. These scholars, theologians, and Christians themselves, I should add, it's not just theologians, but we're looking at actual Christian communities on the ground, the people who stayed in the cities when the plague came in certain Roman cities and started ministering to the poor and the sick there. That would be part of that tradition. And there is a coherence there. As difficult as it is, that there is a thread, there's a golden thread or a red thread, depending on which. Red thread is a kind of a nicer, more biblical allusion, but there's a red thread that I think ties all these things together. And there are certain things that it has in common that has brought, I think are actually assumed by many of us in the West now, but they're assumed because they've been brought in by Christians over a long period of time. So one of them would be deep concern for those who are most vulnerable. And that is not always the case. There are, many cultures, many empires that did not care for those who were weak, those who were unproductive. And Christianity's preference or a heavy focus on those who are most vulnerable or the weakest among us, which draws, of course, from the Jewish tradition. And if you read some of the prophetic books in the Jewish scriptures, which are Old Testament, a very heavy focus on those who are poor and vulnerable. And I think that's sort of one mark of that tradition. Another is a sort of differentiated notion of authority. So Christianity, people like Oliver O'Donovan and many others, of course, said that Christianity was the one religion that said that the authority of the political leaders was limited. You'll see that throughout history in many cases, in whether it's Egypt and Pharaoh, or whether it's Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, that there was, or whether it's Julius Caesar in Rome, there was an equation of sort of the spiritual, the godlike with the temporal ruler. And Christianity was one of the first, following Judaism, to say, no, there's another authority here that needs to be paid attention to. Now, it interacts with, of course, but it severely limited the authority and therefore the power of political leaders. And it subjected them to things that transcended them. I think that tradition has led to all kinds of things, both positive and negative. There's large struggles there, but taken at its best, I think it has led to a limitation of the use of power by political authorities and a subjection of those political authorities to an authority, a moral authority that exists outside of them. They are not above the law, so to speak. There's another law to which they must answer. And I think that's one of them. And then over time, that of course differentiated into multiple spheres of authority, that you had, recognition of the authority of families, of schools, etc., to the point where we have a very vast and pluralist society today. But that's just one example, a very quick sort of glimpse at what we mean by that. There's this notion of multiple differentiated authorities, all the while bound together in a sort of a mutually enabling way that's sort of thriving, seeking the thriving of the human person and all human people, regardless of their status, their race, etc.
So when you say differentiated authorities, are there just two then? The political authorities and the spiritual?
No, I would say that the tradition as fully developed recognizes multiple authorities. So Lisa, you're Vice President of Research within Cardus. You have authority in your position.
In my realm.
In your realm, your proper realm. Now, of course, and you're married, so you have authority within that relationship. You're a member of a church. You have a position of authority within that. People are members of schools, of chess clubs, and what have you. There's all kinds of different ones, and they all interact with one another. These are not, I really don't want to say that these are self-contained units. The point is that they're all these differentiated networks and loci of power and authority, but they're bound together to make something bigger. And they all have it sort of in their heart. There are people there, right? And so that's what they're there. They're there to promote that. A school is something that is made because parents sometimes realize, and many parents who, because have had kids home during COVID, realize this all the more. There are some things that they can't do on their own that it's better to be part of a community to do. And that's where schools, for instance, trade unions, another example, that workers will bind together to achieve certain ends in their workplace community that they're not capable or not able to do on their own.
So would it be accurate to say that in traditional Christian social teaching, what is the good society? It's these different authorities, each functioning in their own appropriate realms.
Yes, and aided and abetted by one another. And so that you mentioned marriage early on, and that's a key thing. It's not just limitations, and we'll talk a little bit about government limitations and others and stuff like that, but it's not just about limitations, it's about how these things work together. So, and our research shows this, and as you said, there's a pretty high degree of consensus on the fact that children that are born in stable marriages, whose parents are together for a long period of time, tend to have better educational outcomes. They do well in school, and therefore they have better employment outcomes. They tend to be healthier. All of these types of things, which just shows that the family is a massive contributor to the state, for example, and vice versa. And if you don't have good laws from the state, chaos ensues. And that's why, I'm so thankful for this country, which is peaceful and prosperous. We have the rule of law, and that rule of law enables all kinds of other things: business, commerce, art, etc. And so they all they're distinct, but they need one another. I know the word ecosystem is overused, but it's just in the same way that, a truffle or a mushroom of some sort will, help keep a forest healthy. That's a similar way to different parts of society. Sorry, I was listening to another podcast on truffles, so that's why that came up.
That's great. And I just have one more thought that I want us to broach just briefly before we jump into talking about this open letter. But is the Christian social tradition left or right?
Good luck pinning us anywhere.
Okay, why?
Because left or right are weak, multidimensional categories. So I'll put it that way. I'll be as blunt as that.
Multidimensional?
They're single dimensional. When actually we need a multidimensional. So am I left? So Cardus, let's take Cardus for an example.
Right.
Are we a right-wing think tank or are we a left-wing think tank?
So most people would automatically jump to the assumption that we're right-wing. For a Christian think tank, we must be a right-wing think tank.
Why?
So
why is that assumption?
Why do people associate? Well, because I suppose the Christians that they see in the media are people who are maybe protesting something or other that is perceived to be a progressive cause, right?
I would say, what makes a progressive cause progressive? So that's the question. So that just goes to show when you start asking these questions. So Cardus, for instance, has written extensively on labor, the importance of organized labor for the flourishing of workers. Now that's typically seen as a left-wing thing.
Right.
That organized labor is seen as a Marxist thing or what have you. But there's this rich tradition in history in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, where there's this rich Catholic or Protestant labor unions that have a distinct view of the importance of workers banding together to achieve common objectives. Now that makes us left-wing. And so some people on the right think that Cardus is a crazy left-wing organization because we support that. Or, for instance, that we'd be willing to say that the state should have a role in regulating schools. And, we do think that that's a role. We think that the state should actually allow more pluralism, but that the state should have some role or has some interest in educational outcomes of its people. Say, well, that's statist. We don't fit the boxes. And the reason we don't fit the boxes is because the boxes do not take into account the full complexity of human individual life or social life. And so let's just get rid of the boxes. Let's enjoy the beautiful kaleidoscope. And I joke, but I mean that seriously. So many of these boxes are, you're a left winger if you want government intervention, you're right wing if you want the market to play more of a role. But what if we need both the market and the government, and there are a whole bunch of things that enable the market and the government to thrive? That's where we're at. We're trying to get into the multidimensional complexity of social life.
Not a binary government or market, or government action, individual action. So often our politics gets locked into those kind of binaries.
That's right.
And we're saying we've got a richer as in more complex and multifaceted vision or understanding of how human beings function, how societies function. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and your point earlier that you mentioned from Lewis, that bit about facts are complicated.
Facts are complicated. Life is complicated. It's one of my, that's my personal tagline. Yeah.
Happens to be true.
Okay, let us then talk about why did we, so we talked it within Cardus before we proceeded to write this open letter. Why did we decide to jump into this issue? Do you want to take first crack at that?
Sure. I think it comes down to, there's a number of different reasons. So we are a think tank. We're trying to influence the things that are going on right now. So the sort of the basest and simplest answer is it's something being discussed right now and it has a matter of public import. So we wanted to have something to say about it. That's
and not just being discussed, but it's a really big discussion and a big issue right now.
Big discussion on a big issue with a lot of different people that affects all of Ontarians.
Affects everybody.
And so
deeply.
So we said, okay, and I think what we wanted to do, Lisa, more than anything else, was to help Ontarians and help our government think through how to think about this. And I think that often doesn't happen. Politicians are so busy, their staff are so busy that they don't have time to think through the big questions. And what we wanted to do is say, take a minute and pause and say, hey, let's think through this. What's going on? What are the implications of this? Are there costs? Are there benefits? Are there things that we should have been paying attention to but didn't? And I think that's the primary driver. And as we sort of looked at it, we found that there was I still think that there's pretty strong evidence that it's affecting certain communities that have often gotten the short end of the stick. It's affecting them disproportionately, and I think that's worth paying attention to as well. We can talk about the extent to which that's true or not, but that was our concern because we've been hearing that from other people in other communities as well. So that's one reason.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. But our primary motivation is just wanting to say here are some thoughts on that might help on how to think through this issue, because as I look back on this paper, I got a copy here in front of me. I'm sort of leafing through again. I wondered if we spent too much time on, and here's what's wrong, in our view, with the policy, and we didn't spend enough time saying, here's what to do instead. I mean, we did have those two parts, but most of the paper was about the first part, and we perhaps didn't give enough in the second part. If I were to do it again, I think I might want to balance that a little bit. I suppose as we were drafting this and working on versions, the first part became the longer part because we wanted to justify what we were saying. You can't just make assertions, you've got to back them up. And also, life is complex, this issue is complex, and so there's a lot of nuance that we wanted to bring in. And so that necessarily made the first part longer, our critique. Then the second part, though, could have been strengthened, I kind of feel. But
yeah, I agree.
Would you agree? Yeah.
I agree. I think part of the reason is that the government the thing was already in place.
It was already in place.
So we're trying to say, here's why you might want to think differently. But hopefully this podcast can help us talk through some of those.
Talk through more.
Why it is that they're, we call the paper "We've Got Better Options," and I do think that we talked about the failures and what we should do instead. I think you're probably right. We talked a bit too much about the failures, but let's talk about that.
Yeah. Okay. Where would you like to? How should we jump in? Maybe just go by section or something.
Sure.
Like the first part is drastic measures call for drastic times, and so the point of this section is to say we are not in drastic times.
Right. Well, let's help the people on the. I'm going to just do a quick thing just for context.
Listeners.
This is written in Ontario, so I think that's an important thing to note too. That different contexts may call for a different response. We may have written a different letter if we were in Florida or some other place where the case counts were different and all the rest of that stuff were different, vaccine uptake, etc. So I just think it's important for listeners to hear that this was written to Doug Ford in Ontario. And it's all premised on the facts that emerge out of Ontario, not in a place like Alberta or BC or Quebec or what have you. So,
good point.
But to your point about whether or not we're an emergency, the government said, and I think this is another point, we actually take not an idealized situation. We can't argue with idealized things. We have to deal with the facts in themselves. And let's just remember that Doug Ford said at one point, we will not do vaccine passports. And because
it was only a few months before implementing them.
That's right. Yes. And they were noted as being divisive at the time by the very person who then afterwards implemented them. And so I think it's just important to remind people of that fact, that we're not talking about an ideal situation here. We're talking about the actual one. And at the time when Doug Ford said, we will not do vaccine passports, COVID-related ICU occupancy was higher than at the time of his hard no. He said in mid-July. So this yes came in September 1st, mid-July, so a month and a half prior, when ICU cases were much higher, when we still had vaccines were readily available. He said hard no. And so at a time when ICU counts were down, when case counts were down, he reversed his no and said, yes, we're going to do them. And I think it's fair to ask the question, why in a time when the very things, the measurements that we were concerned about have improved, do we now need this harsher measure? And that I think itself is a legitimate question to ask. Now, there are people who have good responses to that, but I think that's where we sort of started, that, you said no on this date when the case counts and the ICU rates were this, and now they're better, and then you said yes. On what basis did you say yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to me that points to a really important point, which is we're trying to communicate that if government is going to bring in a very, a policy that has a very big impact, it's incumbent on the government to also explain very clearly the reasons. Yes, this is a very, very strong policy. Will really affect people in many ways. But here's why. We're in a very serious situation, and so I think what we're trying to communicate is tell us why we're in this desperate situation. And we felt that was missing and that needed to be there. Yeah. Now, but how would you respond to someone who said, well, it would be a desperate situation if the passport policy had not been imposed, and it's to avoid a desperate situation. That's the whole reason for bringing in this policy. Yes, we're not in a desperate situation now, but it's because we have this policy in place.
So my response would be, show me the evidence.
But it's not possible to show the evidence because it's what would have happened if we had
well, that's fair. So this is my response. It's not vaccine passports that prevent us from hitting another outbreak. It's vaccines that allow us to prevent another outbreak. Vaccines are highly effective. I think those in ICUs, that the number who are unvaccinated are massively disproportionately higher than those who are vaccinated. We see very few ICU cases in breakthrough cases for people who've had vaccines and so on. So vaccines work. Vaccines are amazing. In fact, Cardus has written on how we could promote them in ways that build social solidarity.
Right.
So that's thing number one. Thing number two is we had, I think at the time, I don't have the numbers in front of me, 83% were fully vaxxed, with another 5% with the first dose. So that's 88% of Ontarians at the time this was announced had first doses.
Right.
We were doing a bang-up job. In fact, for all the criticisms I have of the Ontario government and its failure to communicate, and that's my biggest one, which we'll talk about later, but the one place where it absolutely shone like the morning star was in the vaccine rollout. We actually did a great job of getting it out. It was efficient, it was effective, and we had 88% coverage. That's world-leading coverage. And that's why the numbers are down. And the question I want to say is, I'd love to see, and what I wanted the government to say is, okay, if we're going to do the passports, so let's just actually take the ICU, let's just say the desperate measures call for desperate times. Let's actually give them the benefit of doubt on that and say, I'd love for you to show me how these are going to actually work, how they're going to actually bump us from 88, and why they're necessary when we've had 88% at the time vaccine uptake. We were doing a bang-up job already. We were totally succeeding. And yes, cases were slowing down. I have some actually numbers that we can talk about a little bit later, but we were doing quite well. And in fact, seeing fairly continuous, fairly steady upticks even on first doses prior to that. And so I think the compelling, the compelling case for we need to do this now or else, I just don't see how the numbers back it up.
Okay, that's really helpful to me because if I can paraphrase what you're saying, we can set aside this counterfactual by saying it's vaccination rate that creates desperate or less desperate conditions. And so the whole question about a vaccine passport then becomes, does that increase the vaccination rate? Does that result? Is it an effective means for the end? We're agreeing on the end here, which is the more Ontarians who are vaccinated, the better for getting out of this pandemic. That is the way to get out of this pandemic.
Absolutely.
So let's assume that we could have a separate conversation about whether that's true or false, but I think you and I both agree it's true. At least that's our working assumption.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, does this policy, is it an effective means to that end?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So, yeah. And I would say what matters, the rate matters, of course. So the rate is the percentage of people getting it on a daily basis, uptick or downtick.
The rate of vaccination?
That's right.
Now?
But the real thing is the objective, the objective number. How many Ontarians, we have, say 20, I don't know the exact number, but we have X number of Ontarians. Yeah. How many of them have actually gotten the shot? Mm-hmm. That's the thing that we need to know. And can I share some numbers sort of back up? Sure. So I did some of the numbers. So it's important. This is, again, the complicated facts bit, looking at that. Ontario, to its credit, has been releasing the daily numbers of vaccines. Yeah.
Vaccinations.
Yeah, number of vaccinations. So they've been doing that along with case counts and so on. So here's the case. In the 54, so September 1st was the date that the passports were announced. And so when I did these calculations, it was 54 days afterwards. So on the other side, in the 54 days since the passports were announced, so after September 1st, the average daily number of first doses was 11,833. Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming that what they're really after are the first dose, because once you get the first dose, the likelihood of getting the second is great. Right. So that's after the passport. But if you looked at the 54 days prior to the passports being announced, so the time when we were actually doing well, there was an average of 13,573 doses per day. So we were doing more doses per day.
August or something?
Yeah, we were doing more doses per day. So now you're going to say, okay, well, that's not fair because there, in August and so on, there were fewer people to get it overall. So that's not a fair measurement. What you really have to do is measure the shorter timeline around the announcement of the passports. Make sense? Okay. So 54 days, that's not a good measurement. You can't look at averages of 54 days because you're going back to the time when people were just able to get it for the first time. So of course you're going to get higher numbers. Okay, so now let's look at it from a different area. Let's take the 3-week period prior to and afterwards. The 3 weeks is the time after Doug Ford said no, a hard no. So remember, he said a hard no to them in mid-July. Mm-hmm. And so the 3 weeks prior to September 1st were basically the month of August, the early month of August. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at those 3 weeks, there was an average of 11,705 shots per day in the 3 weeks prior. After the passports were announced, you did see an uptick. There was an average of 13,910 new ones per day. So the difference, if you're going to say that the passport made the difference, what is the actual number of that difference? It's 2,205 more shots per day. Mm-hmm. That's the, so you say, okay, that's as a percentage, that's a significant, that's a good little uptick, right? Mm-hmm. But over the course of those 3 weeks, that equals 46,305 doses, or basically roughly 4 days of doses at the lowest pre-passport rate. So the way I think about it is, we've basically bumped up the timeline by 4 days through this passport. If you're assuming that the passport is responsible for the entire uptick, which I think there's reasons to doubt that, but if you are, so then the question becomes, this gets into the prudence question, was 4 days quicker worth it? Particularly when you ask a couple of things, when you introduce a couple of counterfactuals. One of the counterfactuals would be, have we hardened anybody's opposition to it because of these passports? I think there is some. I think there's some evidence. We cited in our paper some evidence from France on the impact of passports on those who are hesitant. When the passports came in, they actually hardened and became, opposed, anti. So that's one of the counterfactuals that we have to consider. And then the other counterfactual is that the only way we could have gotten such an uptick? Is there another way that we could have done it? And the one thing that's the one question I have to ask is that at the same time the government announced its passports, it also announced what they called its last mile strategy, which was done according to best practices from vaccines, which is community outreach, community information, community access. And that's been shown to be successful in all kinds of places, West Africa with Ebola and so on. And so the question is, how do we actually tease out that difference of 2,205 per day? Was it all the passport, or was it because we had actually gotten into communities and started doing some good work?
Yeah, you don't want to introduce two variables at the same time.
Yeah,
then you don't know what to attribute what to.
And we don't know the answer to that. I think there's good evidence from other places that suggests that community-based stuff was actually pretty effective. So let's take one of the communities we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. In May, prior to May, so Ontario Public Health, again to its credit, has shared actually a good deal of information. Prior to May, they looked at vaccination rates in two categories of, they were concerned about two populations. One were diverse populations, and so that's basically racially diverse people and immigrants. They call that, more or less diverse neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. Prior to May, the more diverse neighborhoods actually had a significantly lower uptake of vaccine uptake prior to May. There was a large effort made into those communities by public health to explicitly reach out to those communities. And after May, you see that number actually go inverse, so that those racialized or those diverse communities actually started to do better. So there's some evidence to suggest that community outreach is a highly effective way of increasing vaccines. Now, they still haven't had inroads with the most vulnerable in those communities. There's a number of Black doctors in Toronto who have said there's still significant shortages and 20 to 30% lower vaccine uptake in communities that are racialized. But the point is, we keep talking about the efficacy of passports and so on. It seems to have had a reasonably an effect, but a reasonably small one. It accelerated our getting to 100 by 4 days. Right. But we don't know whether that 4 days was the cause of the passports. I'm sure there is some impact, and I have some thoughts on who was likely affected. But there were also that other initiative that the government did at the same time that we can't untangle that effect. again, this is Ontario. I think the data in other places like Alberta is slightly different, but I think it's worth asking those questions. In any case, the government didn't share any of the data or any of the thoughts on what its goals or objectives were by putting this passport in. Then they should have done that.
So, building off of what you just said, if the goal of the passports is to increase vaccination rate, prompt people to get vaccinated who aren't yet vaccinated, it would seem to me we have a prior question to ask, which is, why are people not vaccinated? Those who currently are not vaccinated, why not, right?
Yeah.
And what have we heard from the government on that question? Because the answer to that question is going to very much help the government to know whether a passport policy would conduce to prompting people to get vaccinated, right?
Right.
I mean, it would depend on their reasons for not being, right?
Yeah.
I personally haven't read anything that's more than anecdotal about who the Canadians are who are not vaccinated.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is that just a gap? And is it part of our critique that the appropriate public authorities ought to? Do they know that and they're not sharing that information? Are people sharing that information? What do you know about that?
Well, we do have some information.
Okay.
It's not perfect. It's not great. So
Okay.
the one bit is that the government has been monitoring vaccine uptake in diverse communities.
Right.
So they have been monitoring that. And as I said, they're higher in those communities. The younger people in those communities are vaccinated at a higher rate, but those 60 or older, those who are particularly vulnerable to COVID because it has a disproportionate negative effect on people by age, they're under-vaccinated. So we do know that, but why? We don't know why. The margin, like the materially deprived is the way that the Public Health Agency describes it. There's significant neighborhoods where there's significant material deprivation are significantly lower by a margin than those who are in wealthier neighborhoods. So we do know that there are some neighborhoods where the vaccine uptake are lower. As far as the why is concerned, I think there's a whole host of complicated reasons for why people aren't getting their vaccines. Some are good, some are bad, and some are in the middle. And
Good, bad, you mean like justified, not justified?
justified. Some have good reasons. So I'll give you an example of a citizen who comes from a country like China, where there has been government intervention in medical things like childbearing or so on. They would be right to have distrust, at least the distrust in government
It's understandable.
It's understandable,
sensible, yeah.
right? It's understandable to say, okay, look, if you've experienced that in a place like China, perhaps it's understandable that you have a distrust in medical authorities in Canada. So I would say that's one of the good. Now, I think that can be addressed by outreach and actually speaking to people. There are others who have concerns, or some just don't have concerns. Some have just had inertia. And when you talk to people in public health and they look at, say 20-year-old men, with some of the things that young men in their 20s, the people most likely to be fine if they get COVID, or not fine, but have, one of the least likely to end up in the hospital.
Don't get seriously ill.
They don't get seriously ill, and they're busy doing other things and so on. That was what I understood was a low uptake.
Okay.
But then there are other people who have, for a variety of reasons, some, I would say, less convincing to me, objections. They just oppose the state telling them what to do. There's concern about that. I think there are certain concerns in certain religious communities, like in Aylmer, for instance, that there's a religious basis for their opposition. Whether that's appropriate or not is another question. But you're right. It'd be interesting to hear the government say, who are these communities, and what appears for them, the government to actually get to know that.
Yeah. So what I would have loved to see is when the passport policy was being announced, the government saying, okay, publicly, as part of their communication about this and why they had come to this policy, would be, there's this percent of Ontarians who are eligible for vaccination and have not yet had their first dose. And we have done research to the best of our ability to understand the reasons why. And there is X% of those people for whom it's really just a question of inertia. And this policy will prompt them to take that step because suddenly they can't enter restaurants and whatever, and they're going to get the vaccination. Yeah. And we know that there's this percent of people for whom the policy will just harden. Their primary reason is, I hate it when the government tells me what to do and I'm not going to do it. And we understand that by bringing in this policy, that's probably going to harden a lot of those people. They're going to be even less likely to get the vaccination than they were before. However, that group is of this size. This other group of inertia people is of this size. We made that calculation, and we believe that overall, this policy will increase the vaccination rate. Like something like that would not go a long way to help.
And I think it would help build trust.
Build trust, right. Okay, let's talk about trust.
Yeah.
If we go back for a moment to our earlier conversation about the sort of different spheres of authority, not only exercising their authority appropriately in their various roles or spheres, but also supporting one another in doing it. Mm-hmm. That requires trust.
Yes, it does.
It requires that, you take it from here. Say more about that.
No.
And how has how have we seen trust functioning in this issue?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think trust comes when you say something and you do it. Distrust arises when you say one thing and you do another. And I think that Ontarians, as a parent who's experienced an announcement coming from the Minister of Education on a Friday, and then a completely opposite announcement coming from the Premier on a Monday. And this is just one example, I think, of a large basket full of examples where the government has failed to do that and failed to share the information, as you said, as you described perfectly earlier about, I wish they had said this, and so on. Mm-hmm. I think that's the problem. That's the problem here, is that my concern about the vaccine passport is that it's going to undermine trust in the very public health authorities that are necessary to bring us through this pandemic and the next one, because there may come another one at some. They tend to come every 100 years
very
or so.
Likely.
It's very likely. And if we are undermining the trust in the institutions that have the capacity to help bring us through this, as we've seen this, we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot for the next one. And that's my concern. And if there's actually good data on that, Lisa. So there's a high correlation between places where trust in government is high, so a place like Denmark. Now, Denmark is unique because it's like culturally homogenous and it's very small and so on. But in places where trust in government is high, compliance with vaccine not compliance, but like uptake of vaccine has been higher. Compliance with public health measures has been higher. Places like Poland, where they have a legitimate distrust because they were ruled by the Soviets for so long, there's this really sort of skepticism of government and distrust in it. Massively lower uptake, and that's what we want, the government to consider, and that's why this type of intangible things like trust really matter, and that's why being clear about not just your motivations but the data that you're using to arrive at that is so critical for public health success.
Yeah, I want to adjust something slightly that you said earlier. Trust comes from distrust comes when the authority says one thing and does another. I agree with you, but I would really say trust in authority comes best when the authority explains how they reach the decision. When they're authentic and honest and share the information and explain how they arrived at the decision that they are now implementing. Yeah. In my own personal experience, as somebody who's had in the workplace leadership over others, that is the best approach that I've found. What I find is that almost everybody is willing to accept the outcome, when those other things are in place. When I'm authentic and open about how I arrived at the decision and why I believe it's the best one, and when I'm communicating that to people in a respectful way toward them, even if they don't agree with my decision, they are much more willing to accept that that is the decision, and that someone needs to make the decision. It's appropriate for the leader to, and we're all going to move forward on that basis. And the trust is as strong as it can be. Yeah. And I think that's true for in the really big picture with government over millions of people.
Yep.
Right? And I think we've seen real failure there. And I'm wondering why exactly. It seems like it should be pretty simple to do.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, your articulation is way better than mine. I think you're right. Like, I think the way you've described it as being clear, sharing the data, the information, the thought process, the logic that you used to arrive at that is super. I don't know why governments failed to do that. I think early on they did that, and there was a tremendous amount of grace extended to the governments early on.
Yes, early on. We were all like, okay, we've never experienced this before. We got to shut down for 2 weeks. Oh my goodness.
That's right. And I think people were willing, as you said, willing to give the government the benefit of the doubt, because we all sort of said, we don't know what the hell we're doing.
We don't know what's going on. And we realized the government doesn't know either, and they're just trying to cope.
They're just trying to do their best. And there was an authenticity there, and I think, one of the, Ford's a populist, and that's the one thing he's very, very good at that. And I actually, people were like, yes, we're willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. I think over time, as more and more data about COVID came out, as certain policies, and I'll mention here I'm going to mention the churches, for instance,
Sure.
Churches, mosques, synagogues.
Sure.
Because I actually think there was a failure here. And I think even with the vaccines, there's a failure to understand religious communities. And I think that's a long-term failure of government, that the way in which religion motivates people, it's not that they're being deliberately obtuse, although sometimes I think they are.
Those are the ones that get into the news.
Those are the ones that get into the news, But I think in general, I think people over time, let's take, there's a certain segment of the religious community that's vaccine hesitant. And I think part of that arose because they saw, why is it that my, the mosque is closed, or why is it that the synagogue or the church is closed, but the liquor store down the street can have as many people? Like, that didn't make sense to people, and they couldn't understand the logic, and the logic the government provided wasn't there. Right. And for something that's so core to people, to have that taken away, and I think, in BC, it was even worse than in Ontario. Right. I think Ontario at least tried. I don't think they did a great job of understanding those communities, but they at least tried, and made a better job. But if you fail to account for the daily experience, going back to that thing from Lewis, of your actual citizens, and you try to say, this is the way your citizens need to act, instead of trying to say, how are you acting now, and how can we walk alongside you to address those concerns, you're going to fail. You're going to have policy failures all the time. And I think that's what's going on here to some extent. I think that's to some extent the distrust has been earned by not intentional nefarious actions by the government, but a failure to properly understand the communities.
Right, that's a good way to state it. I'm not suggesting there's some kind of like malicious intent or something in these failures.
Because in other places, so in Nova Scotia, for instance, there are a large number of black churches in Nova Scotia, part of the history of Nova Scotia, the history of Canada. And the government right away said, we're going to work with the elders and the pastors in those churches to promote vaccines. Massive success. Wow. Massive success. The Ontario government knew in May, if not earlier, that there was some hesitancy in those communities. And I'm really interested to know, did they have a plan to reach out to those communities in good faith? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's just another example of how I think our society could do with, the authorities could do with actually understanding the role of religion in people's lives a little bit better. Anyway, just a thought.
I think that's really great. That's a really great point. I think a lot of assumptions are made, right? That may or may not bear out. And also, religion is a complex phenomenon that's got different elements for different people. I mean, for people in the Christian world, which I know better than other faiths, in some church traditions, there's a sacramental theology, which is you need to participate in those sacraments, which are bodily activities, whether it's the Mass or others. For other Christians, streaming a service online and watching it doesn't replace being there in person, but it doesn't change the nature of the grace being bestowed on you as it is through the sacraments for those who have a sacramental faith. So just not knowing that. We should probably wrap this up soon, but I want to perhaps tackle one last topic, which comes at the very end of our paper, and we talk about Canada's pandemic preparedness plan, which was in existence before this, and it said it sets out two goals: to minimize serious illness and overall deaths, and to minimize societal disruption generally.
How'd that plan work out?
How did that work out? And I think that this gets to what we call in the paper COVID exceptionalism. And also, I was thinking back to we had a live event, which people can still watch the recordings of, back in June, called Exit COVID. And we wrote a paper for that too, and we talked there about a lack of weighing things against each other and just having sort of an absolutism. Yeah. And we've seen a sort of absolutism on this issue take root, right? Yeah. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, because I actually think that gets into the sort of the complicated facts and some of the understanding the experience. The absolutism is what I actually think it also contributes to distrust. It doesn't allow for the nuance that is sometimes there. Now, there's a limit to this nuance. Just to be clear, I'm not saying we have to accept every position as equally valid, but you at least have to approach it and understand it. And if you can't understand it right away, our response should not be right away to say, do this or else. And I think there's been a lot of the do this or else mentality. I think it's creeping into all kinds of things that makes for an unhealthy society after we exit this pandemic.
Yeah, I think so.
I'll give an example. A lot of places right now are making vaccines mandatory for the maintenance of your employment.
Right.
I think there are real challenges for that. So, I've seen various lawyers, like I think it's Howard Levitt and so on, saying it's totally legal. I don't care whether it's legal or not. I want to know whether it's good or not. And so you have these situations where, I come from a union environment, right? And often I want to find accommodations. You want to find ways, okay, you have this concern right now. Let's find a way to accommodate that concern if we can. It may be that you can't, and at the end of the day that has to happen. But I don't think there's been a willingness to try to understand and accommodate people and walk alongside them and take a little bit more time to bring them around. It's been a very heavy-handed response, and particularly on things when I've heard from the one minister saying these people shouldn't even be able to access EI because they've quit of their own volition, etc. That is just hard-hearted. And again, not likely to contribute to the solidarity that we need to face the next crisis. And solidarity, going back to Christian social teaching, is at the core of that. What's going to bind us together? And the more we get into the, you're all in or you're all out, that's divisive, and it's unlikely to lead to the type of ties that bind, and the ties that bind us together so that we're stronger to face the next crisis. And I think that's at the heart, of what we're trying to do here at Cardus, and what we're at for this paper, was to try to find ways, how do you build solidarity while fighting this heinous virus that's affected so much of us and has left so many people destitute. So
I think that's a great point. And it reminds me of, I once took a course on conflict management. It was a fantastic, life-changing course. But one of the things that we were taught to do there is, so often when there's a conflict, you visualize yourself across the table from your opponent, and you're both fighting for your own position. And instead, you need to think of yourselves, both parties need to think of themselves as being on the same side of the table, and on the other side of the table is the problem. Mm-hmm. And they are seeking to find a solution to that problem that they can both accept, that meets both their needs, that, whatever. And that's my image now of solidarity. Together, we need to face this pandemic together as Canadians instead of pitting ourselves against one another. So
it's a good spot to end.
Yeah. So listeners, thank you for listening. Maybe you thought this was too long. We decided to do this naturally and to keep talking till we sort of felt we had said most of the things that were on our minds. And with the idea that people can stop and start listening as they choose, or can just click off and not finish it if they don't want to. However, if you have got this far, if you would like to send us comments, which we would love to receive from you, you can email either of us. So Brian Dijkema's email is Dijkema, I guess we better spell that, BDIJKEMA @cardus.ca. And mine, Lisa Richmond, is Richmond, like Richmond Hill, Ontario, @cardus.ca. Or you can just find our email addresses on our website. We would love to hear from you. Tell us what you thought of this. As we said at the beginning, this was an experiment, and we are interested in doing this again and doing this more. So we envision, if there's interest on the part of you who are listening, we are thinking of, as we bring out research reports in the coming months, to have this kind of conversation about the underlying or background thinking that went into these reports. We're also potentially thinking about talking to guests from time to time. So thank you for listening, and bye for now.
Farewell.